All right, and welcome here to Dragonfly Joe's. This is the first episode, this is the first review that we are going to be doing as we look at many of the G.I. Joe figures and vehicles, some of the history behind them, even the accessories that they come with, as well as the production of looking at some of these storylines of these characters. So I hope you enjoy this. If you're a G.I. Joe fan from the 80s and even the early 90s, I hope that you will enjoy these productions. Now we're going to go through these year by year and in alphabetical order, just to stay away from any favorability, just to be able to show that each and every one of these G.I. Joes are very special. They do have their unique qualities and something that we want to be able to really highlight instead of showing the top 10 list or one thing versus another, who's better at what not. And we just want to be able to continue in the love for G.I. Joe characters. So come on with us as we take this journey, starting in 1982, which is the first year of the re-release of the G.I. Joe figures. If you're familiar with G.I. Joe, you do know they came out earlier in the 12-inch figures. We're looking specifically at the 3 3/4-inch figures that began in 1982. And alphabetically speaking, we are starting with Breaker.
He'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. It's here, the G.I. Joe collection. Communications officer, code name Breaker.
The communications officer. Breaker, that came out back in 1982, is the straight arm figure. There are some later figures that came out after this year where there was more articulation with the figure itself, but here we're looking at the very basic, the very beginning of G.I. Joe, which if this failed, nothing would have continued after this, but we'll see how awesome these little figures are. So Breaker, the communications officer, he comes with a backpack, not just any backpack, but a backpack that contains a TV and radio on it, as what you might expect a communications officer to be able to have. Also, being a soldier, he has to come with his helmet, and the unique thing about Breaker is that he has a communications headset that attaches to his helmet. We'll get into that in a second, but first of all, who is Breaker? On Breaker's file card, which is included with every figure, on the back of the packaging, we have this file card that gives us a little bit of a background to the G.I. Joe figure itself. Well, Breaker's name is Elvin Kibbe. He's from Gatlinburg, Tennessee, which kind of ties in a little bit later. We'll see how Gatlinburg may tie in with Breaker later on. And his primary military specialty is infantry, meaning he is a soldier. He's out there on the field. Now the difference here, just to start off, as we'll see later on, most of the other figures of G.I. Joe came with a secondary specialty that's mentioned on their file card, but Breaker doesn't have that. And you might think that someone could have at least mentioned communications as a specialty, but here maybe it's just a given. Maybe it's just something because it's already included in his title that they figured, while his title is his secondary specialty, why be redundant about that? And as we look at his grading, he has an E4, which basically means that he is a corporal, which many of the original G.I. Joe figures held this ranking. It says that Breaker is familiar with all NATO and Warsaw Pact communication gear, as well as most world export devices. His specialized education was Signal School, Covert Electronics, and Project Gamma. Now the Signal School, or Corps, handles all of the communications and systems of information of the armed forces, which would have been perfect for someone like Breaker. Project Gamma is a special forces branch from 1966 and 1970 that ran operations in Cambodia, which could give us a little bit of a hint of this character that Breaker could have served during the Vietnam War. And it also shows a little bit about Breaker's age too. We also read that Breaker is qualified with an M16, an M1911A1, and a MAC-10. Now, even though Breaker is an expert in these weapons, the figure came with none of them. And something else that we read about Breaker is considered here to be classified, and that is the fact that he speaks 7 languages. Again, not only is he a communicator in getting information back and forth within his own troops and his own crew, but he has the potential to be able to do this in several different countries, as he's able to speak several different languages. So that makes him a very valuable part of the G.I. Joe team. All of these file cards for the figures also came with a quote, and that doesn't always tell us who is quoting this, but something to give us a little bit about the personality of the figure. And here with Breaker, we read that He's efficient and self-assured and has an uncanny ability to turn adverse situations to his favor. So that kind of gives me the idea that Breaker is a pretty smart guy. He's very witty. He's able to handle himself in tough situations and figure out the best in all situations to be able to turn things around when the time comes. So let's look at Breaker. Again, in 1982-83, Breaker first appears in the G.I. Joe comics in issue number 1, and he also shows up in the first 5-part miniseries, cartoon series that was put out by Sunbow, known as A Real American Hero. And the thing about Breaker is that he's always known for being clean-shaven and chewing bubblegum in the comic series. In fact, in the comic series, the bubblegum is usually the best way to be able to distinguish him from another G.I. Joe character known as Grunt. But Breaker wasn't always portrayed this way so much in the cartoon series or as the figure. He had the look of actually the original G.I. Joe figures with the big scruffy beard and the hair and the helmet. So he's kind of a callback to those original G.I. Joes. And if we did continue in watching that cartoon series, we also find another communication officer, someone maybe to help Breaker or to fill in for Breaker, named Sparks. Now, Sparks was another plain-looking Joe without much to be known for, and actually he never had a figure made of himself. And we could probably guess why. It just didn't seem to make sense to start to invent this new character in order to replace Breaker when Breaker wasn't really being used much in the first place. More recently, a newer release of Breaker's figure actually came with a bubblegum accessory that could attach onto his mic, again, for that iconic picture of how most of us would probably know Breaker if we were more familiar with the comics. In the live-action movie of G.I. Joe that was released back in 2009, his look, Breaker's look, is extremely different. He's looking more sci-fi, and his nationality has actually been changed to Moroccan. Now, going back to the figure, Breaker, again, he came with no weapons for him to carry, which might have disappointed some of the kids who were looking for a traditional army figure, but maybe some of the parents were happier with this. In fact, there are many G.I. Joe collectors who have memories of Breaker being their very first G.I. Joe. Now, even though he didn't come with any weapons, he does come with a very cool communications headset. The headset looked like the classic 80s oversized headphones with a long wire, which, if you had the figure, could easily break off. And it also restricted his head movement just a little bit because that wire was plastic. In later versions of G.I. Joe, those wires were replaced with small, removable rubber hoses that were much more flexible. But the downside to that was something else that could be lost if you were a collector of G.I. Joe figures. Hasbro did make accessory packs in later years for broken or lost parts, but those were usually painted different colors too in order to let everyone know who still had the original parts and who didn't. One of the good things about having accessory packs, though, is that Breaker could always access a weapon from those packets, or he could borrow one from one of his other Joes to make him look more combat ready. The other accessory for Breaker was that TV radio backpack. There's not a lot of detail in the original backpack of that, it just shows basic squares, but it was supposed to be one of the modern high-tech devices in order to communicate from anywhere in the battlefield, which was very cool to have. For kids playing outside in the grass somewhere, being able to communicate with headquarters, that was always something we always wanted to do, and Breaker was the guy to be able to do that. Now, there are some unremovable accessories for Breaker, including his Kabar knife and a hand grenade on the straps over his shoulder. Pouches were included on the side of his pants for carrying any kind of maybe technical data. If he had a weapon, we might consider this some storage for ammunition, but again, he doesn't unless we give him one. And his code name may be a little bit outdated from its original intent. It could be a reference to truckers back communicating in the 80s with another trucker about traffic or just kind of keeping each other company, where they would usually say, "Breaker, breaker, come on in," things like that. Now it's referred to in another specialty with technology as someone who could break codes or to hack into computer files. In fact, in one of the more recent cartoon versions of G.I. Joe Renegades, there is a portrayer of someone named Breaker who is a younger version and kind of a nerdy, geeky kind of guy who works mostly on computers. So again, the idea of being a breaker has changed from its original intent. Now, Breaker was available up until about 1984, The straight arm version, as I mentioned earlier, was from 1982, but later, in versions known as 1.5, the swivel arm battle grip versions of Breaker were released in 1983. This gave us a better way of being able to position or maneuver or even hold weapons, if Breaker had any, to be able to do that in a more realistic way. In fact, later on, in about 1986, a new communications officer was introduced, known as Diotone. And he, in a sense, replaces Breaker as a toy and as a figure, but also in issue number 109 of the comics series. You'll see a lot of upgrades from G.I. Joe's 1982 communications officers to the 1986 one. For instance, looking just at the color, the accessories, and the technology. And Breaker overall is a pretty plain figure. He's more of a bare model that could be added onto, which what the other figures are pretty much based on, as we'll see when we continue looking at some of the others in 1982. So what was it about Breaker, this no weapons, generic looking soldier that any child could find appealing? Well, maybe it's because he was the one portrayed on one of the most popular G.I. Joe vehicles ever created, the Ram motorcycle.
G.I. Joe! Go get Breaker! He can do it! It's a rapid-fire motorcycle!
G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe is there.
Now, even though any other figure could ride a Ram, they all had to put away their weapons in order to drive it, which is something I cannot stand. I do not like taking the weapons, the backpacks, or any other accessories out of the hands of my Joe figures. But Breaker can still wear all of his gear, be fully equipped while riding into battle on a Ram motorcycle. The Ram more than makes up for Breaker not having any weapons with that massive Gatling gun as a sidecar. Gatling guns were created by a man named Richard Gatling, and it's used as the sidecar, and this goes back and reminds us of the very place where Breaker was born, in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Honestly though, if it weren't for the Ram motorcycle, I'd probably have Breaker just sitting at the computer console in the 1983 G.I. Joe headquarters, because I really wouldn't know what else to do with him. I mean, the only other reason I could think of having Breaker around in battle is in case you need to be able to call in an airstrike or a chopper rescue, someplace to get you out of a hostile environment. Maybe be able to coordinate the missions with others, who knows? We do know that Breaker, besides being featured on the Ram motorcycle, he's also known as manning the bivouac with another character named Short Fuse. Again, just being out there in the field, being able to communicate with the rest of the team. Either way, you can't say that you didn't need a communications officer as a part of G.I. Joe. And Breaker definitely provided a much needed function for the Joes to be able to have with them. So it would be false to say that this figure or any other 82 figure is boring. These are the classic standard bearers. They may not have some of the more colorful uniforms and some of the more fancy vehicles that came out later, which is actually why some collectors stopped collecting in the later years, but these represented the truest American heroes to many who loved G.I. Joe. If these figures didn't work and bring excitement to children, G.I. Joe would have fallen before it ever took off the way that it did. Well, that's going to wrap it up for today looking at Breaker. I hope you enjoyed this, but what are your memories? What are your thoughts about maybe G.I. Joe, the cartoon, the comics, the figures? And what did you think about Breaker? Anything that you may have seen that would have stood out or that you really enjoyed if you had this figure? Let us know down in the comments. Remember to subscribe. Remember to click the notification bell, as we will be putting out more of these videos reviewing some of the figures and where they were, where they came from, and what they've done. So thanks for watching, and keep a lookout for upcoming videos. Yo, Joe, and thanks for watching.